Hello and welcome to the 8th talk of our online series Behind the Scenes Analysing Anglo-Saxon Rendlesham. I'm Alice DeLeo, the Project Delivery Officer at Suffolk County Council Archaeological Service, and today we'll be hearing from Stuart Brookes about Rendlesham's administrative landscape. We're excited to be hosting this online series in partnership with two projects. Rendlesham Revealed, led by Suffolk County Council Archaeological Service, funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, and Lordship and Landscape, led by Christopher Scull and funded by the Leverhulme Trust. You can find the videos of our earlier talks on our website at heritage.suffolk.gov.uk/Rendlesham. I'll now introduce you to Stuart Brookes. Stuart is a Senior Research Associate and Teaching Fellow at the University College London Institute of Archaeology. He specialises in comparative landscape studies and the archaeologies of state formation. Stuart is involved in several ongoing research projects, including travel and communication in Anglo-Saxon England, based at University College London, and people and place in the Kingdom of Northumbria AD 300 to 800 with Durham University. He also oversees the Early Medieval Atlas, an open access archive of spatial evidence for early medieval Britain, made available through the Archaeology Data Service. We're pleased to have Stuart as part of the Lordship and Landscape team, reconstructing the evolution of the administrative landscape around Rendlesham and what this can tell us about early territories and communities. So Stuart, when you're ready, over to you.
Thanks, Alice, and good morning, everybody. As Alice mentioned, I specialise in landscape archaeology and the spatial analysis of archaeological evidence. And my role on the project has focused particularly on analysing the densities of artefacts across Rendlesham to inform our interpretation of the site, and at a wider scale to analyse the distributions of contemporary settlements across the East Anglia region, and to develop different kinds of archaeological sampling procedures to help us evaluate Rendlesham in its landscape context. And it's this latter theme that I want to focus on today. So my paper forms, in a way, a kind of companion piece to Tom Williamson's lecture in week 2 of this series. So if you're not watching this live, you're watching the recorded version, it'd be worth watching that paper first and then coming back to watch this one afterwards, because I'm going to be developing some of the ideas that Tom introduced in his paper to think about the economic and social hinterland of Rendlesham and how this is expressed geographically. And I'm going to do that really in 3 parts. Firstly, I'm going to set out some of the ideas and models that scholars of this period use to think about territorial development. Secondly, by describing some of the methods that we're using on our project. And finally, summarising how this can be applied to chart territorial developments in southeast Suffolk between the 5th and 11th centuries. As you all know by now, if you've been watching these lectures, is that Rendlesham is identified as the location of an East Anglian royal settlement of Vicus Regius in Bede's early 8th century Historia Ecclesiastica. And the quality and the quantity of the material recovered from the site is compatible with the idea that this is an elite complex in the period, the 7th century, when Bede refers to events taking place there. Taken together with the evidence for the princely burial at Sutton, just down the road, there can be little doubt that we're looking here at an important territorial focus of East Anglian royal power in the 7th century AD. But this identification raises a number of related questions that our project is aiming to address. What exactly did this early East Anglian kingdom look like? How extensive was it? Can it be reconstructed geographically? How was it organised? And did elite settlements in the 5th to 8th centuries influence subsequent patterns of settlement and activity? Now, before we can begin to answer those questions, I need to introduce some of the terms and the models that scholars of this period use to think about territorial development. From early sources, we know of a number of different kinds of territorial entities that existed in the early medieval period. Bede, for example, refers to territories using the Latin terms regiones and provinciae, and such territories may on occasion have been relatively well defined. Both regiones and provincia are often named with reference to geographical features such as rivers or important central places. And they're often co-areal with geographical basins defined by watersheds, and these factors allow us to identify some of them on the ground. Perhaps the most widely known of these is the province, or the regio, of the Hrothingars in Essex. That's it there. And the extent of this putative folk grouping, the land of Hroth's people, is argued to be represented by an adjoining cluster of 8 parishes, all of which are named Rodding, lying either side of the River Rodding and extending to the watershed of the river basin. So here you have the 8 parishes lined up either side of the river, and the parish boundaries define more or less the extents of this regiones at a later date. There are other examples in the literature. I've just got a couple listed here: the Stoffingers, the Brothing in Hertfordshire, and these are here all at the same scale. And it's interesting that all of these are relatively small, and they often carry the community names in Old English. And there are various different community names in Old English that might give us indicators that these were conceived as a kind of folk group, a group of people. So Ingath, which means the followers or the people, the Setter, the Hem, the folk, and so on. So it's the compound of this group name along with the territorial definition of these areas that allow us to identify these particular types of territories. Now, from the way that Bede uses these two terms, it's clear that provincia were larger territorial entities than regiones, and indeed this is, when they have been reconstructed, is exactly what seems to be the case. So, for example, Bede refers to 2 provinciae, the provinciae of the Meonwara, the dwellers of the River Meon in Hampshire, and the Sunningas in Berkshire. And there's been reconstructed by different scholars, Bruce Eagles in this case, and John Blair in this case. And these, quite clearly, I've projected them here at the same scale as the Hrothingars. You can see a lot larger territories than the regiones that have been reconstructed. And from the 8th century, we start to hear of other kinds of territorial entities, recorded first in Wessex in the 8th century and later elsewhere. We hear of subdivisions of kingdoms known as shires, although when these are first referred to, they seem to relate both to larger territories equivalent to the counties that we know of today, but also much smaller land units, which scholars have called small shires. So here's the example of Hamptonshire, the original small shire, serving Hampton, Southampton in this case. And many of these shires appear to be connected to royal villas and have a kind of network of dependent settlements on which these are focused. And from the mid-10th century, sorry, we hear in legislation issued by King Edmund and then King Edgar about hundreds or wapentakes in the area of the Danelaw, and these apparently would seem to be a system of organising armed forces. And this list isn't exhaustive. There are other territorial units which we also know about and are mentioned, the Laths of Kent you might have heard of, the Ridings of Yorkshire, and nor does 100 in Hampshire necessarily mean the same thing as it did in Lincolnshire or Leicestershire, where they seem to be subdivisions of wapentakes. But for the sake of our purposes today, it should be clear that there existed a range of different types of territorial entities that existed in the early medieval landscape, and that these may have come about by quite different processes. Some might have originated as early groups of people, as might be suggested by their community names. Others might have been more akin to micro-kingdoms. Shires and hundreds, on the other hand, would seem to be essentially administrative divisions for the purposes of raising troops or levying taxes, and were from the very outset divisions of larger political entities. That's to say, they were ways of administering increasingly complex fiscal and military arrangements of expanding kingdoms. Having said that, there might be some blurring between these territories, and that might account for why some hundreds take their names from groups of people. We've got some examples close to Rendlesham. Hundred like Blithing in Suffolk combines the river name Blythe, the pleasant one, or the slow-moving one, with that group element Ingas, so the people of the River Blythe. And it raises the question, I suppose, whether these administrative divisions that are also respecting or formalising communities on the ground. So one can have both a group and an administrative division existing in the same. And if that's the case, then later evidence for administrative divisions might give us clues about administrative or territorial divisions that existed at an earlier time. So are these fossilising things that have been around for some time? Two further aspects are worth discussing or noting about these territories before we move on. Some, as we've already mentioned, appear to be associated with or administered from royal estates. So Hamptonshire, we've already introduced, was a district associated with Hampton, with Southampton. And we've got other cases here in East Kent. We have 3 eastern provinces fossilised as laths, and each of these appear to have been served by a central place denoted by the place name element Yea, meaning district. The excavation of one of which at Lyminge has demonstrated emphatic evidence for a late 6th and 7th century royal vill. So here we have a district associated with a early central place. The second is that these often appear to have a geographical coherence, confining themselves to river basins defined by watersheds, with denser settlement in the valley bottom and more temporary settlement on the higher ground beyond. And the social and economic logic of this arrangement has already been described by Tom in his lecture in week 2, and is encapsulated really in what he called the river and wold model. And that's the essence of which is described here. So the river and wold model posits that territories emerged and solidified over a relatively long time scale as a result of the different types of farming practices that are associated with different types of landscapes. So you have more dense settlement in the river with the more amenable soils, and the further you get from the river basin into the more marginal landscapes, we have more temporary land use associated with those areas. And the river and wold model has a number of important corollaries which provide us really with a way into start thinking about the territorial development of East Anglia. So if we take that argument of the river and wold model further, it suggests that settlement pattern, the population pattern, is going to be expand at times of high population growth into those more marginal zones, and at times of smaller population are going to contract back into those river valleys. So we might look at population over time indexed against that environment. It also suggests that there's this inverse power relationship between the river and the wold. So the core area of settlement along the river basins is the more dense and important settlements, whereas in the more peripheral zones, in the Walden regions, we're looking firstly at more temporary settlements and then over time appurtenances or subsist settlements that are supporting the core rather than being important in their own right. And it's really this model, I suppose, that we can start to think about how that power dynamic, that settlement dynamic, can ultimately lead into the administrative geography. Because if these territories fossilise those same human population and land use patterns, then one ought to see encapsulated in these territories, in these administrative territories, something that stretches back into the settlement and population dynamics that existed at an earlier date. So let us now turn then to the methods of territorial reconstruction. I'm going to focus on just 3 of these. There are other approaches too. I want us to think about how we might identify territories using the environmental evidence, using that river and wold model to reconstruct different elements of the environment. I'm going to think about how we can identify territories using Doomsday Book, so working retrogressively through the evidence from Doomsday Book to look at what is the state of the administrative landscape in the late 11th centuries, and then how we might populate these different territories using the archaeological evidence. How do we think about putting the evidence into these different environmental and administrative niches? So Tom's already introduced the techniques that we've used on the project to thinking about the environmental evidence, and you may not be able to make out the labels on this, but he described how one might use the different categories of soil type as a way of identifying qualities or possible qualities of agricultural use. So in white, just looking here at the Deben case study around Rendlesham, in white we have the amenable soils, the sandy, chalky or loamy soils that are attractive for early settlement, as well as the more slopy clays. In this kind of slightly darker pink colour, we have more problematic sandy and silty soils that are not as amenable to settlement. In this yellow colour here, we have the more difficult, flatter clay soils, and then in blue, expanding beyond the river the edges and the coastal plain, we have waterlogged peat, sand, fen, floodplain, former coastal marsh, these kinds of more waterlogged soils. So we have these 4 principal categories, and onto that basic framework of landscape, we can then overlay further evidence for woodland, wood cover, and so on. So we have ancient woods, we have place names containing the Old English woodoo, wood and their cognates. We have early parks, these green blobs, 19th century woodland, remnant woodland, as well as post-medieval commons and heaths, these large areas. So these all would seem to be areas that, for whatever reasons, historically have survived as woodland or semi-woodland, indicative of pastoral land use rather than agriculture. So this was the idea that we had looking at the Deben Valley, and of course we can extend that same model across East Anglia. So here we have those same colours denoting the different coloured soils, and we can make out more extensive tracts in white of the most attractive, amenable soils, and these variations of pink and beige that denote the more difficult soils. Overlaying this, then we can plonk our woodland cover as reconstructed from Doomsday Book evidence for woodland. It's in a very approximate model, but it gives us at least a sense of how wooded, or at least those areas that were designated as wood in Doomsday Book for the purposes of woodland woodland agriculture. And that gives us a very rough model, I suppose, of East Anglia, into which we can then predict core areas of main settlement. So we've got some pretty large areas. These are areas that are clear of wood and have expanses of good quality soil. So we've got the southeast Suffolk pocket of good quality soil, another one up here on the North Norfolk coast, and so on. And I suppose squinting at this map, one might also make out some smaller, medium-sized pockets here in the area of Hoxton or Keister, and a few smaller ones still, particularly around the edges of the Wash and the western part of East Anglia. So just looking at this basic model, one might already imagine a kind of environmental niche in which these different settlements or most dense areas of settlement might occur. And if we drop onto that map the evidence of 5th to 7th century cemeteries, this is based on Sam Lucy's work, there's an okay fit in some of these pockets, but there are also a number of cemeteries that exist outside these pockets. So it's an imperfect model, but it gives us a way of thinking. We could also drop onto the watershed boundaries. So these are the principal interfluves between the major river boundaries. And here we have a better fit in that the interfluve between these pockets, particularly here and running up around here, seems to subdivide some of these different pockets of landscape. But again, it's not a perfect fit in every case. And that may partially be explained by the flatness of the East Anglian landscape, in that water basins aren't as clearly defined as they might be in more stark relief. So there's the environmental backdrop. Against that, we can also plot the administrative evidence, the evidence of the administrative landscape. And here we're relying really on the evidence of Little Doomsday Book, which covers Norfolk and Suffolk. And Little Doomsday in some ways is actually better for these purposes than Great Doomsday Book, in that it lists the places, but also the hundreds in which land holdings were held. And this is really work of many scholars down the years, is to try and identify those hundreds on the basis of the individual vills. So you would plot the vills, and then you would look at the parish or charter boundaries that surround those vills, and you would use those parish boundaries as a guide to the areas that were contained within each of these hundreds, these administrative districts. And by this process, we can map out not only the individual vills. We could populate a map of Doomsday England on the basis of all the named places, but we can also plot out the hundreds to which each of these vills belong. So Doomsday Book contains two quite interesting data sets which can be analysed in different ways. We could look at the territories, the polygons, if you like, of each of these hundreds and how those are made up, but we could strip out also the point data, the evidence of individual vills, and apply different methods to thinking about how we analyse those. And archaeology has lots of different methods for analysing point pattern data. We could just skim through these very quickly. There are ways of extracting point data and thinking about how the pattern of those points might reflect densities of settlement, say, or population density, and that might get us a way into thinking about, well, what are the core territories, what are the areas that have the densest settlement? Can we use this pattern of vills as a way of thinking about those areas of densest settlement? And this is the sort of thing that Roberts and Rathmell did, looking at 19th century vills and hamlets to think about the spatial patterning of the 19th century landscape. And I might do exactly the same thing using Doomsday evidence. So if we plot out the vills in Doomsday Book, we can plot those all out, and we can apply various different types of spatial analyses to figure out areas of greatest density. So we've got point density estimations, we've got kernel density estimations, and those consistently highlight two areas of very dense settlement, greatest density in the area of Ipswich and the Deben, but also around Keister. And that's kind of interesting for things we'll talk about in a second. But this point pattern analysis is already highlighting what in the 11th century at least were areas of densest settlement. Point pattern kernel density estimations are just one method. Very quickly, another one might be network analysis. So these looks at the kind of spatial relationships between individual points to build up a kind of network, and one can apply various algorithms to these networks to think about the strength of interaction based solely on proximity. So here, various different ways of constructing those networks. My colleague at the University of Helsinki, Elias Oksanen, has done a very nice kind of longitudinal analysis of settlement in the East Anglian landscape, comparing Doomsday villas using this kind of network analysis, 14th century villas and the 19th century settlement pattern. And it's interesting that particularly in the early two phases of this analysis, one has a very dense and networked zone in southeast Suffolk, which still exists in the 14th century, but is already broken now by the time we get to the 19th century. So we appear to be looking time slice at regional groupings of settlements that gradually eroded as we went through the second millennium. So one can extract the point data from Doomsday, but one can also extract the hundredal data, so the polygons, if you like, to think about patterns of administrative territories and how those might have come about. And there are things one might look for when one projects the different administrative districts like that. And one could look for areas of regular or irregular hundredal form. And that might relate to different phases in which they come about, on the assumption that the closer to Doomsday Book, the more regular the administrative districts would look. The older they are, the more irregular they might be. One could look at the degree to which these boundaries of these hundreds interdigitate. How do they kind of come together? And might that mean that, you know, if they were linked together, locked together, does that mean that formerly they were part of the same area that's been subsequently subdivided? One could look for areas of common boundaries or common meeting places. Each of these hundreds often takes its name from the meeting place in which the people of that hundred assembled for the purposes of military mustering or paying taxes or whatever. So one could also look at the evidence in Doomsday Book for the types of meeting places that existed. And this is based on work that my colleague and I, John Baker, have been doing for many years, is to look at the different types of assembly places that existed in these landscapes. And we have a typology of meeting places, which can be superimposed on this map of hundreds. And those might give us further clues about, you know, these arrangements of hundreds, whether those meeting places are on boundaries, whether they are at the points where these hundreds converge, or whether they are centrally placed within individual hundreds, which might suggest that both the meeting place and the hundred belong to the same phase. So here's just an example of the regularity I was talking about. So we've got a group of 400s here around Hoxton. You can see they all converge on the same point. They have a central meeting place at the centre of those four neighbouring hundreds. And together, each of these looks similarly sized and indeed has a similar fiscal value. So the assumption here, looking at that block of four, is that regularity might suggest that these four quarters were laid out at the same time rather at different times. So that's an example of regularity. Here are examples of irregularity, in that here in southeast Suffolk, you can see really complex boundaries. In fact, many of these are have detached parts of these hundreds interdigitated with each other. Same sort of thing happens in the north of Norfolk, and this kind of interleaving, interdigitation and subdivision may suggest that, you know, these are parts that have been subdivided that were formerly part of the same territory, same area, but have subsequently been chopped up into smaller units. One could look for common boundaries. So those of you who saw Tom's lecture will recognise common boundaries where one has these kinds of T-junctions at the corners of hundreds where this suggests that those two neighbouring hundreds date to the same period. And this has a common boundary that encloses all three of those hundreds to form a nice river valley basin. And this issue about common meeting places I've already mentioned. Note this one here. You have these little fingers of the hundred reaching out from all directions. And again, that suggests that there's a meeting place right at the point of a larger territorial unit, which was subsequently subdivided. So using these methods, we can pull out what appear to be just some of the territories, the Hoxton regular grouping I've mentioned, the Keister river valley I've mentioned, in this interdigitated territory in the southeast of Suffolk, known as the hundreds of Wicklow, 5.5 hundreds, which were individually very disjointed but overlap to form this coherent basin. And in this case, we know that these hundreds were grouped together in the mid-10th century when they formed part of an endowment to Ely. And Peter Warner has already argued that there is circumstantial evidence that this territory, even though it's first referred to in the mid-10th century, may be much older. And we have this very large hundred with the community name Ingas contained in it, we've already mentioned too. And we plonk our Woodland back on here, we can see that there's a reasonable overlap, particularly in the Wicklow and the Keister examples, with these open areas that the environmental evidence had already suggested as pockets of good quality land. Less good fit in the area of Hoxton and a less good fit in the area of Blything, but Keister and Wicklow seem quite convincing. And then finally, we can just plonk the archaeological evidence into these individual case studies to think about this issue of population growth, the core periphery issues of the river and wold model. And in the case of the Deben, we have our HER data, the 207 sites that we know dating from the 5th to mid-9th century. And what we've done is extracted that data, merged them into hexagons, choropleths that counts the number of events that occur within each of these hexagons as a way of stripping out or plotting out those points at particular time slices. So we have the late Roman evidence. You can see it's a relatively sparse evidence of late Roman and early 5th century, with a cluster in the area of Rendlesham. Note the elite indicators in stars. These are objects that we think are indicative of prestige of elite activity, things like gold, silver, garnet imports, and so on. So Rendlesham already appears significant, but there are other places in the area of Sutton to the north of Rendlesham where there are also little clusters of elite activity and dense fine spots. And then as we move through phase 2, the significance of Rendlesham becomes increasingly pronounced. So we have more evidence in the area of Rendlesham, but also clusters up the Finn Valley, still at Sutton, and so on. And it's in phase 3 where things really concentrate for the first time fully just on Rendlesham. So whereas in phase 2, one might have recognized 2 or 3 different clusters of activity, here we're seeing everything concentrated mainly on Rendlesham. There's some expansion of settlement onto the poorer, more marginal soils, you should note here as well. And this might be indicative of precisely what the river and wold model predicts, in that we have this kind of concentration of activity in the core, but simultaneously expansion onto more marginal zones. So the elite activity focuses here, it disappears largely from everywhere else in the region, and we are seeing an increasing exploitation of more marginal soils beyond that core province. And then as we move into phase 4, the 8th and early 9th centuries, we're starting to see the decline of Rendlesham as a settlement. There are far fewer finds, far fewer elite indicators, and more evidence of more middling settlement, particularly in the south and west of this Deben case study. So putting this all together suggests that we're looking at an intensification of royal power that manifests itself at a variety of levels. As Chris has already discussed in his introductory lecture, around 570, 580, we see the establishment of the hall complex at Rendlesham, with attendant evidence for new levels of wealth, international contacts, elite signalling, and so on. And this material that appears at this phase is of a type that might be associated with regional elite rather than locally influential families. So we appear to be looking at a scale change in political power to something more overarching. So rather than these triangles, these groups of local leading families, we now have overarching power signified by this new category, class of material. Now, as we've talked about today, this scale change also has a territorial dimension, where larger, more complex forms of territorial entities emerge from more smaller localized ones. So in phase 2, we have a number of different clusters across the Deben that represent possibly these smaller groupings of families. But in the late 6th, early 8th centuries, we see this focus on Rendlesham, and perhaps for the first time the formalization of this larger area as the administrative hinterland to the Rendlesham settlement. And this concentration that we've mentioned suggests that we're looking at a territorial arrangement of a system of surpluses, extraction and jurisdiction, at the centre of which lay Rendlesham. And it may be that in other territories in southeast Suffolk, we're seeing further elements of this same development. So in phase 2, there are lots of middling assemblages. These are just the elite material that I'm plotting here. Relatively small assemblages in the order of 5 or 6 objects, and relatively evenly spread across the area. But as we move into phase 3, the same phase that we're seeing the concentration at Rendlesham, we're seeing similar concentrations, particularly at Keister, where more middling sites disappear and primary sites emerge as the main centres of elite consumption within possibly the formalisation of these putative territories. As power was manifested over people in space, this might be read as evidence for the moment when these territorial units first become articulated. So what have we looked at today? We've used different techniques to unpick the palimpsest of territorial organisation, using historical geography, landscape archaeology, place name, spatial statistics, a whole range of different methods that we're using as part of our analyses. We've looked at the evidence, archaeological, cartographical, that the economic and social hinterland of Rendlesham developed in tandem with that at the site, and that this process of kingdom formation might be visible across a wider landscape and the evidence contained in that wider landscape. And we explored some of the ways in which territorial geography might reveal, amongst other things, the processes of kingdom formation. And in the way that we've just skimmed across, we can already see that a long chronology has to be accepted for the basis of what become the administrative territories by the time we get to Doomsday Book. Some might have been very old indeed, some could have been quite recent, and we need to very carefully look at each of those to try and pick out how that palimpsest is superimposed upon each other. We've seen some evidence for territorial expansion, consolidation, that kind of scale change issues, and how local groups might be swallowed up by larger political entities, but also that this exists at different temporal scales, that these things are happening all the time across the first millennium AD. And finally, we've also introduced evidence for the geographical constraints in which territories developed, a kind of cultural ecological model, if you like, that there are underlying environmental conditions that we need to take into consideration when we're thinking about early medieval settlement and land use. Thank you.